Morning. I'm Brenda Brasher, and I have the delight of kicking off the conference by introducing the founder of our feast. This is a man that he encouraged me to tell you at least one story about the Center for Millennial Studies, so I'll tell you our founding myth, and that is that I was at USC and doing research on rapidly growing new Christian congregations over a number of years, a study funded by the Lilly Endowment. And one of the things I was finding at all of these congregations was that they were quite millennial and very interested in end times. And we did a survey, and like 99% of the pastors believed that the world was going to end within the next 5 years, and the principal investigator of that study didn't want to hear about it. I was frustrated, found Stephen O'Leary, we talked together. Richard, who was a friend of Stephen's, comes out, and we're all sitting around griping about how no one wants to hear about end times issues and do serious research on it. And so the three of us did a three-way handshake and said, you know, we've got to do something so that scholarly research on this can proceed. And in his way, I wasn't able to do anything about it, and Stephen wasn't able to do anything about it, and Richard got his act together, and found the funding and started the Center for Millennial Studies at Boston University. I think it was really exciting for a few years leading up to the millennium. But since that time, a lot has been happening, and I'm so pleased that we're getting together today to look at one dimension of what's been happening in the past decade or so. For those of you who don't know him personally, Richard is an American historian and author of numerous volumes. He specializes in as a medieval historian, but he's really gone to school on contemporary apocalyptic in a variety of dimensions, which is quite cool. He's a wonderful person to associate with, one of the most honest and considerate scholars I have ever met, who shares credit, who welcomes junior people, who respects senior people. My respect and strong feelings of admiration for this person know no bounds. So with that, I give you the founder of our feast, as I said, Dr. Richard Landis.
Actually, one of the interesting things about the Center for Millennial Studies, which had a run of about 7 years from 1996 to 2003, was that people would always ask me, what are you going to do after the millennium? And I tried to explain to them that the millennium being the kingdom of heaven on earth, it was hard to say what one would do after it since it wasn't about to happen. But that after the year 2000, we would be studying disappointment. And as most scholars of millennialism understand, disappointment can sometimes be toxic. So I'd like to welcome you all here today. I'd like to thank the History Department and Scholars for Peace in the Middle East for co-sponsoring this last conference of the now defunct Center for Millennial Studies, which raises its head one last time. This conference is long overdue. It should have taken place in what I call the aughts, the early aughts. That is the first decade of the 21st century. Or for we medievalists, the first decade of the third millennium. And the reason it should have taken place is that millennial studies focuses on that peculiar group of people who not only believe that heaven will come to earth, that is the millennial kingdom of peace, brotherhood, and abundance, but believe that the apocalyptic moment when sacred and profane history reach their combined cosmic climax is about to happen. Indeed, it is happening. Such believers in earthly perfection have entered apocalyptic time and set off on a path to heaven on earth, to the millennium. Such a definition certainly describes global jihadis well. They believe that now the time has come for, to paraphrase Freud, where there was Dar al-Harb, there shall be Dar al-Islam. The vision takes multiple forms, from a top-down global caliphate to a bottom-up imposition of Sharia worldwide, and depending on the circumstances, these scenarios can shift from one to the other and back with ease. In this sense, any Muslim who strives, the meaning of jihad, for this millennial dream, whether by violent or other means, I think can be reasonably described as a global jihadi and as an apocalyptic millennialist. This dream is obviously a bold one, so extravagant and unlikely that most Westerners hearing about it consider it a bad joke, or at least they did back in the 90s when it first became known. But again, one of the characteristics of millennial believers is what I call outrageous hopes. It's obviously a bold dream, so extravagant and unlikely that most Westerners hearing about it consider it a bad joke, but those of us familiar with millennial dreamers and their deeds, it's no joke, it's bad news. Many global jihadis belong to the most dangerous kind of apocalyptic believers, what I call active cataclysmic. That is to say, they believe that immense devastation must occur in order to purify the old corrupt world and prepare the way for the new world. In Christian premillennial parlance, this is known as the Great Tribulation. And most apocalyptic scenarios have a cataclysmic dimension to them. But in many of them, it's what I call passive cataclysmic, that is to say that God is the one who brings about the devastation, or nature, or the forces of history. But in this case, and in some other cases, we're dealing with a belief that the believers themselves are the agents who carry out this devastation. The first law of apocalyptic expectation is that of unintended consequences. Namely, wrong, they've all been wrong so far, does not mean inconsequential. Indeed, active apocalyptic movements have, since the Taiping in China in the 19th century to Pol Pot in the later 20th century, been responsible for megadeath on a scale of hundreds of millions of people, sacrificed in order to carve out the new world on a body social, a reluctant body social that must suffer to be redeemed. One can, and I'm sure many do, object to this broad definition both of global jihadis and apocalyptic millennialists, both, one could argue, contested terms. Broad definitions when discussing so sensitive a topic. As the current turmoil within the Ummah are not generally welcome and often dismissed as essentializing. But Pache Blake, who generalized that to generalize is to be an idiot, I do not think this optic upon which we've based this conference is as an exercise in analytic thought. I do think that it offers us some valuable returns on the mental experiment. First, because it warns us about certain key elements that newcomers to apocalyptic millennial dynamics might miss. And I think there's a fair number of people who are studying these movements who really either have no idea that there's this apocalyptic dimension, or if they do, they tend to dismiss it. So just some of the dynamics that apocalyptic, attention to apocalyptic helps us with. One is identifying the memes, not always explicitly tagged apocalyptic, we'll come back to this later in the conference, that carry their beliefs, tracking those beliefs as they spread from the margins into the public sphere. The ubiquity of failure of expectations, not just despite, but especially with the inevitably partial success of taking power. One of the striking things about millennialists is because they have such outrageous expectations, even when they succeed, they're disappointed. The cognitive dissonance that comes with that failure and the multiple forms taken to reduce that dissonance, The agility of apocalyptic jazz, in other words, improvising with the apocalyptic scenario in order to stay in apocalyptic time. So if you've gotten into apocalyptic time, you believe it's the end, and the prophecies that you were counting on to make it happen have not happened, you're perfectly capable of changing the apocalyptic scenario. And one of the ways, one of the more unfortunate ways that that change can happen is to go from passive cataclysmic to active cataclysmic. In other words, if God's not going to bring it about, then we'll do it. The mutation of both means and goals in this apocalyptic jazz, the consecutive waves, in some cases full tide of waves, and I would suggest that we need to think about the apocalyptic dimension of global jihad in this generation as a tide, not just a single wave, and that tide may last a century. It may be going from 1400 to 1500. But it's certainly one of the things that we see, for instance, in the arrival of ISIS, as the Al-Qaeda wave is not necessarily failing, but not continuing to gain speed, another wave from ISIS, and who knows what's behind that one. The links between fragility and violence is one of the things that millennial scholars, especially, I think Catherine Wessinger wrote a fair amount about this, about how violent apocalyptic groups that feel fragile, and with disappointment they feel fragile, are subject to paranoia and violence. The potentially toxic, potentially valuable dimensions of apocalyptic expectation and millennial hopes, I personally think that the modern West is in fact the sort of unintended consequences of millennial expectations, and the enormous gap between what I call the apocalyptic roosters, the people who crow that now is the time, and the normal time owls, that is the people who say, oh no, it's still the middle of the night, go back to sleep. Indeed, on that last point, when we discuss whether ISIS is Islamic and what its connections to normative or mainstream Islam are, we essentially grapple with the difference between roosters and owls. Like their Christian and Jewish counterparts, Muslim readers do not read the same Quran, not because they read different words, but because they read them differently. To quote Blake again, both read the Bible day and night, where they read black, I read white. I first heard of apocalyptic Islam and the penchant of some of their prophets and calculators of the end for the year 2000 from David Cook back in 1994, and about jihadis and their global ambitions from Daniel Pipes in 1997. At all of our annual conferences here at the CMS, we had papers on apocalyptic Islam, and we published articles on the subject in our short-lived Journal of Millennial Studies. At the approach of 2000, we had our 15 minutes of fame with journalists calling constantly for interviews. But after 9/11, crickets. While there was ample interest in Christian apocalyptic thought, no one seemed eager to hear about what today we cannot help but pay attention to. I remember a call from the BBC. They wanted to interview me on Bush's apocalyptic beliefs. And I said, well, I'll be happy to do that, but I also want to talk about apocalyptic beliefs in global jihad. And their answer was sure. So they interviewed me and just tossed the stuff on jihad and went after George Bush for being a wacko. Indeed, as millennial scholar tracking global jihad as an apocalyptic movement, that is, tracking the move from the margins, even of the Muslim world, where David Cook first spotted it in the 1990s. I mean, when David Cook first started working on these groups, you know, they were, even within the Muslim world, they were on the margins. Towards the center, where it now makes the radar screen of journalists like Graham Wood, I shouldn't even necessarily say in the plural journalists like Graham Wood, because I think you are one of the few, if I'd argue that the turn of the third millennium of the Common Era marks a key moment when global jihad made major advances in both the Muslim and the Western, indeed the global public sphere. Normally, when these movements go public, they run into crushing opposition, beaten back by those responsible for public order, whether that be the Romans or, as we shall shortly hear, the Turks, or today, the gatekeepers of this public sphere. Instead, these memes gained credibility and spread rapidly from 2000 onwards. This happened primarily in the Muslim public sphere, where both the Al-Aqsa Intifada and 9/11 had electrifying effects, but some of these memes also took with a movement calling itself the global progressive left in the Western public sphere, in particular the adoption of memes that depicted both Israel and the United States as the Dajjal or the apocalyptic enemy. These millennial jihadis view the Western-driven globalization of the last half-century as a vehicle for their redemptive vision. Eusebius had depicted the Roman Empire as the Praeparatio Evangelica, the preparation for the eventual victory of Christianity in this world. Unbeknownst to those who built it, Imperial Rome laid the groundwork for the spread of Christianity. The Pax Romana, despite being nailed down with crucifixion, nonetheless created the ideal conditions with its roads and protected travelers and semi-literate population for the spread of Christianity. Similarly, I suspect many jihadis view the phenomenal success of Western globalization not only as a massive threat, that's unquestioned, but also a massive opportunity. Western globalizations, with its products ranging from cyberspace to weapons of mass destruction, has brought the Islamist millennial dream within reach. Globalization as Praeparatio Califatae. So why has it taken so long to have this discussion? Part of the reason is the powerful impact of a meme known as Islamophobia, a concept that those who use it define as, quote, dread or hatred of Islam, and therefore the fear and dislike of all Muslims. Whatever the value of this contestable and essentializing definition, I especially like the idea that it means dislike of all Muslims, those who deploy it have, over the last 2 decades, expanded the definition to include almost all negative attitudes towards Islam and stigmatized them as a form of racism, as if an ideology were in any way racially connected. In this form, Islamophobia has become a weapon used by nonviolent jihadis and well-meaning Westerners to silence a wide range of criticism. Anything that hurts the feelings of Muslims, that is, that in the latest jargon creates a space that makes this underrepresented minority feel unsafe, can be the occasion for eruptions of unsafe space for those accused of Islamophobia, racism, and related accusations, as in the case of Andrew Pessin at Connecticut College recently. There are even efforts to criminalize Islamophobic hate speech today, which David Miliband of the Labour Party candidate, promised, if elected prime minister, to support. Given the startlingly problematic, if not really deeply disturbing content of so much of the apocalyptic jihadis' thinking about infidels, as well as insufficiently fervent Muslims, especially infidels who refuse the summons to convert, it's hard to talk about apocalyptic jihad without saying things that not only shock our liberal sensibilities, but understandably disturb and wound the feelings of Muslims who either do not know about or do not want to know about this aspect of their religious inheritance. Largely, David Cook's groundbreaking book, Contemporary Muslim Apocalyptic Literature, largely ignored by a herd of Mideastern scholars wedded to the post-colonial paradigm, was refused publication initially because readers considered it hate speech. What did they mean by this? That reading all the hateful things David chronicled in this depressing study might lead people to, quote, fear and dislike Islam. Now, why would Western scholars make so elemental and dangerous a conflation as to consider writing about hate speech a form of hate speech? Especially when such an attitude meant silencing a critical discussion about a very serious form of hate speech. And silence did indeed happen. The project Facing History, dedicated to preventing the kind of demonizing discourse that led to the Holocaust, would not touch the distinctly genocidal hate speech of apocalyptic jihadis, even as it raged during the aughts. In a sense, the fact that it took 15 years and the appearance of the most heinous form of apocalyptic jihad so far, that is ISIS and Boko Haram, to finally produce this conference is testimony to the power of this stifling of discussion. One solution to the problem has been to say ISIS is not Islam, that even talk about radical or violent or extremist Islam is so insulting to Muslims whose religion has nothing to do with such notions that we might drive the moderates into the arms of the radicals, which is really a startling proposition when you think of it. Among those encountering the incontrovertible evidence of apocalyptic themes amongst jihadis, this move takes the form of, oh, so this is about apocalyptic, it's not about Islam. Indeed, apocalyptic jihad may not be the essence of Islam, we certainly all hope so, but it is essentially Islamic, and it harkens back to Islamic origins. Muhammad was an apocalyptic prophet who announced the end of the world, the Last Judgment. And at Medina, he and his followers, in the absence of that Last Judgment, turned a passive cataclysmic eschatological movement into an active cataclysmic apocalyptic movement, which, with its stunning success, stunning global successes, mutated into a millennial movement of world conquest, Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb. To state that global jihadis are genuinely, if unusual, apocalyptic Islamic movement, that they read and invoke central Islamic texts literally, that their recruiting appeal targets both Muslims and infidels, with a message of authentic and soon-to-be triumphant Islam unadulterated by quotidian compromise and cowardice, is a basic step in being able to track that movement. To deny it, no matter how well-meaning one's desire to protect moderate Muslims from opprobrium, only serves the apocalyptic jihadi strategy by making it impossible for the target culture, us infidels, to even identify, much less think about the problem. It is to the end of thinking and talking about what, to use Harry Potter talk, is that which must not be named, that we have gathered this conference. Nor are we gathered here free of the efforts to silence. This conference still operates under threats of violating red lines declared by those who accuse others of Islamophobia. At one extreme, Ayaan Hirsi Ali will have to bring her own security detail here, and wherever she speaks, and as she warns, freedom of speech should not be a privilege, which she has the privilege of free speech because she has a security guard, but it should in fact be a right. But in the century of jihadi suicide bombers and execution squads, that's really not an option. For those of us who assume that we have the right, not the privilege of free speech, however, we all operate under pressure, not necessarily directly from Muslims, but from colleagues and associates, pressure not to bring down upon ourselves accusations of Islamophobia, not to be denounced as racist bullies. Such accusations can, as in the case of Ayaan, occasion ostracism, as at Brandeis. Here, the enforcing authority is not jihadis themselves, but our colleagues whose proleptic fear of criticizing Islam may or may not be phobic, but whose anxiety around anything that might arouse suspicions make them vulnerable to the kind of stampede against Andrew Pessin that happened at Connecticut College. With those sober, if I hope, bracing remarks, as Blake says, bless, relaxes, damn, braces. Let the discussion begin. Thank you.